Margaret had been a nurse for 30 years before she took the position at the Harrison estate. At 58, with silver streaks in her auburn hair and hands that had comforted countless patients, she thought she'd seen everything. But nothing prepared her for what she would discover in that grand Victorian mansion. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Mrs. Catherine Harrison needed a live-in nurse for her daughter Emma, a frail 12-year-old who had been mysteriously ill for months. The pay was generous, almost too generous, which made Margaret wonder what she was getting into. When she arrived at the sprawling estate, Mr. Thomas Harrison, a successful banker in his early 40s, met her at the door. His face was drawn with worry, dark circles under his eyes betraying sleepless nights. His wife Catherine, an elegant woman in her late 30s, stood beside him, her hands clasped tightly together. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Thomas said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Emma is upstairs. She barely eats anymore. The doctors can't find anything wrong, but she keeps getting weaker." Margaret followed them up the curved staircase, her years of experience telling her this was more than a simple medical case. The bedroom was beautiful, decorated in soft pinks and whites, with expensive furniture and shelves full of books. But the little girl in the bed looked like a ghost. Emma's blonde hair spread across the pillow, her face pale as moonlight. When she opened her eyes to look at Margaret, there was something there, a flicker of fear that didn't match a typical sick child. "Hello, Emma," Margaret said gently, sitting beside the bed. "I'm Margaret. I'm here to help you feel better." The girl's lips trembled. "No one can help me," she whispered. Over the next few days, Margaret watched Emma carefully. The child would eat when encouraged, but she never finished her meals. She slept fitfully, often crying out in the night. During the day, she seemed anxious, her eyes constantly darting toward the floor beside her bed. Margaret checked her temperature, her pulse, her breathing. Everything was normal, yet Emma continued to fade. The doctors had run every test imaginable. Blood work, scans, allergy tests, all came back clear. It was as if the child was willing herself to be sick. On the fourth night, Margaret woke to the sound of soft sobbing. She rushed to Emma's room and found the girl sitting up in bed, tears streaming down her face. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, turning on the small bedside lamp. Emma's eyes went wide with panic. "Please don't tell them," she begged. "Please. Tell them what, dear?" The girl's whole body shook. "About him." Margaret's heart began to race. "About who, Emma?" Before the child could answer, there was a small sound from beneath the bed, a shuffle, a breath. Margaret felt her blood run cold. Every instinct from her decades of nursing told her to be calm, to be gentle, but to act. She knelt slowly beside the bed and lifted the dust ruffle. Under the bed, curled in a nest of blankets and surrounded by half-eaten food from Emma's untouched meals, was a boy. He looked about 14, thin and terrified, with dark hair matted against his head and eyes that held years of pain. "Please don't hurt him," Emma cried. "Please. He's my friend." Margaret sat back on her heels, her mind racing. She looked at the boy, then at Emma, then back at the boy. "Last son?" she asked quietly. The boy's voice was barely audible. "Daniel." Margaret took a deep breath. "How long have you been under there?" 3 months, he whispered. Everything clicked into place for Margaret. Emma's mysterious illness, her refusal to eat fully, her anxiety, her declining health. She had been hiding this boy, feeding him, protecting him, and the stress and fear had been making her sick. "Emma," Margaret said gently, "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" The girl nodded, tears still flowing. "Daniel, I need you to come out from under there. I promise you I'm not going to hurt you." Slowly, the boy crawled out. He was painfully thin, his clothes dirty and torn. When he stood, he swayed slightly, weak from months of hiding. Margaret's heart broke. "Sit down, both of you. I'm going to get you some proper food, Daniel, and then you're going to tell me everything." Over warm soup and bread, the story emerged. Daniel's father had died 2 years ago. His mother had remarried a man who drank heavily and used his fists freely. One night, after a particularly brutal beating, Daniel had run away. He'd been sleeping in the woods near the Harrison estate when Emma found him. "I saw him by the old oak tree," Emma explained. "He was hurt and scared. I couldn't just leave him there." "Why didn't you tell your parents?" Margaret asked gently. Emma looked down. "Father is always busy with work. Mother worries about what people think. I was afraid they'd send Daniel back, or call the police, and he'd have to go home to that terrible man."
Ow.
Daniel spoke up, his voice stronger now. "Emma saved my life. I know I shouldn't have stayed, but I had nowhere else to go." Margaret sat quietly for a long moment. At 58, she had learned that life was rarely simple, that right and wrong often wore complicated faces. These were two children, both scared, both doing what they thought they had to do to survive. "I need to tell your parents, Emma," Margaret said finally. "But I promise you, I will make sure Daniel is safe." The next morning, Margaret sat with Thomas and Catherine in their study. Their faces went through a range of emotions as she explained: shock, disbelief, guilt, and finally, understanding. Under her bed, Catherine whispered, her hand over her mouth. "For 3 months, and we never knew." Thomas stood and walked to the window. When he turned back, there were tears in his eyes. "What kind of father am I that my daughter was too afraid to come to me? The kind who works long hours to provide for his family," Margaret said firmly. "The kind who loves his child but perhaps forgot to show her that some things matter more than appearances or rules." Catherine was crying now. "What happens to the boy?" "That depends on you," Margaret said. "The law says certain things, but the heart says others. Daniel's situation needs to be addressed properly. His stepfather needs to be investigated. But that boy needs safety, stability, and kindness right now." Thomas and Catherine looked at each other, a silent conversation passing between them. "Bring him to us," Thomas said finally. When Daniel was brought to the study, he stood trembling, expecting punishment or worse. But Thomas walked over to him, and after a moment's hesitation, placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry you felt you had no one to turn to. I'm sorry my daughter felt she couldn't trust us with this." Catherine stepped forward. "We're going to help you, Daniel. The right way. We'll contact the authorities about your stepfather. In the meantime, you'll stay here properly, with a real bed and regular meals. We'll figure out the rest together." Emma, who had been standing in the doorway with Margaret, ran into the room and hugged her parents. For the first time in months, color was returning to her cheeks. In the weeks that followed, Emma's health improved dramatically. With the stress and fear lifted, she began to eat properly and sleep soundly. Daniel, too, began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The authorities investigated Daniel's stepfather and found enough evidence to press charges. Daniel was placed in foster care temporarily, but the Harrisons visited him regularly and eventually became his. Legal guardians Margaret stayed on for 3 more months to see the transition through. On her last day, as she packed her bags, Emma came to her room. "Thank you, Margaret," the girl said. "You saved us both," Margaret smiled, the lines around her eyes crinkling with warmth. "You saved each other, sweetheart. I just helped you find a better way." As Margaret drove away from the estate, she thought about what she'd witnessed. 2 children had found compassion in each other when the world seemed dark. A family had learned that love means seeing beyond your own comfort to the needs of others. And she, at 58, had been reminded that it's never too late to do the right thing. Even when it's complicated, sometimes the greatest acts of kindness happen in the most unexpected places, even under a little girl's bed. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Leave a comment below telling us about a time when kindness changed someone's life, yours or another's. Your stories inspire others to spread compassion in this world.